Before the world was torn apart by fire and steel, before the bombs fell and millions vanished into history's dark pages, there were whispers, whispers of ambition, power, and a promise of a new world order. The truth of World War II didn't begin with the first shot. It began in the silent corridors of power, where greed, fear, and ideology danced together in secrecy. The world after World War was broken. Empires had fallen, economies had shattered, and nations bled both in pride and spirit. Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, was forced to kneel, stripped of its strength and dignity. In the streets of Berlin, hunger walked hand in hand with anger. The people were desperate for hope, and out of that despair, a name began to rise: Adolf Hitler. But Hitler's rise was not a miracle of destiny. It was the result of manipulation, money, and global interests. Hidden hands from Europe's elite, and even from across the Atlantic, saw opportunity in chaos. Industries, banks, and politicians each played their part in shaping the monster that would soon engulf the world. The hidden truth: many who condemned him later had once empowered him. Meanwhile, the world watched in silence. Britain and France, still scarred by the Great War, chose appeasement over action. The League of Nations, meant to guard peace, stood helpless. And while nations debated, Germany rearmed, factories hummed again, tanks rolled off assembly lines, and the swastika spread its shadow across Europe. But beneath all this, there were secrets, covert deals, forbidden experiments, and alliances forged in darkness. War wasn't just about soldiers and battles. It was about control of land, of people, of knowledge. The truth was hidden behind closed doors, written in coded telegrams, and signed under candlelight. The world was on the brink. The pieces were in motion, and the storm that was about to come would not just destroy nations. It would expose the deepest corruption of mankind. In the next part, we uncover how Hitler turned broken Germany into a war machine, and how the world's silence became his greatest weapon. Germany in the early 1930s was a nation reborn not in peace, but in vengeance. Hitler's voice echoed through radios and rallies, promising a new dawn for a humiliated people. The streets that once starved now marched in perfect rhythm, their faith forged in fury. But behind the spectacle of nationalism, a far darker plan was unfolding, one that would turn Germany into the deadliest war machine the world had ever seen. Factories that once built cars and tools began producing tanks and aircraft. Scientists, engineers, and generals were summoned to serve the Führer's dream. The Treaty of Versailles had forbidden rearmament, yet deep underground, secret weapons programs thrived. The hidden truth: many nations knew and quietly looked away. Across the Atlantic, American corporations traded with Germany under different names. Oil, steel, and technology flowed discreetly through neutral borders. Business had no loyalty, profit did. And while Europe's leaders preached peace, they quietly prepared for war. The shadow network of finance and power ensured that Germany's rise was not only possible, it was profitable. Propaganda became the heartbeat of this new empire. Children were taught that Germany was destined to rule. The media painted Hitler as a savior, the military as holy. Doubt became treason. Truth became whatever the Reich desired it to be. Every home had a radio. Every wall had a symbol. The swastika became not just a flag, but a commandment. By 1936, Hitler's war machine was unstoppable. The world saw the parades, the shining uniforms, the roaring engines, but not the hidden camps where weapons were tested, or the prisons where dissenters vanished. Behind every victory march, there was silence, the silence of those who feared, those who obeyed, and those who profited. Germany's first bold move came with the remilitarization of the Rhineland. It was a gamble, a direct violation of the Versailles Treaty. If France or Britain had resisted, the Nazi army would have fallen. But no one moved. Not a single shot was fired. The world blinked, and Hitler learned his greatest lesson. The world was too afraid to stop him. From that moment, he knew his path was clear. The machine was ready. The people were loyal. The world was unprepared. In the next part, we'll uncover how Hitler expanded his empire not through force at first, but through deception, alliances, and betrayal. Power is never built alone. Even a dictator needs allies at least until the dagger turns. As Germany's war machine roared to life, Hitler's next move was not to fight, but to form bonds. Some public, others hidden in the smoke-filled backrooms of Europe and beyond. These alliances sealed in fear, greed, and strategy would decide the fate of millions. In 1936, the world saw the birth of the Axis powers. Germany found partners in fascist Italy, led by Benito Mussolini, and Imperial Japan, whose militarists sought to dominate Asia. Together, they promised to reshape the world, to carve it into spheres of power. Europe, Africa, Asia, each a chessboard. Each move planned long before the first battle. But behind the headlines and the handshakes, secret pacts were made. Hitler's diplomats courted nations through promises and deception. Some leaders admired his rise, seeing him as a bulwark against communism. Others saw him as a temporary tool, a means to their own ends. Yet in the shadows, Hitler was already plotting betrayal, for in his mind, there could be only one empire. One of the most dangerous alliances was not political, but economic. Foreign banks continued to fund German industry under false fronts. Raw materials from neutral countries slipped quietly into German ports. Oil, rubber, steel, all the lifeblood of war flowed into the Reich disguised as trade. Officially, nations condemned Germany's aggression. Unofficially, their industries thrived because of it. That is one of the hidden truths. War was business, and business was booming. In the East, Hitler's attention turned toward the Soviet Union. Despite their ideological hatred, both sides signed a shocking pact in 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Publicly, it was a non-aggression treaty. Secretly, it was a map dividing Eastern Europe into zones of conquest. Poland's fate was sealed before the first German soldier crossed its border. While leaders smiled for cameras, armies mobilized in silence. While diplomats spoke of peace, death trains were already being prepared. Hitler played the world like a game of chess, moving with precision, striking with deception, and always thinking several moves ahead. The alliances were set. The board was ready. The storm clouds gathered once more. The next chapter in this dark story would begin with fire and the sound of marching boots crossing the Polish border. The Second World War was about to begin. September 1 Street, 1939. The world awoke to the thunder of engines and the scream of warplanes. Germany had invaded Poland. It was the spark that ignited the deadliest war in human history. But what most people never knew is that the invasion was not a sudden act of madness. It was a carefully staged performance, planned, rehearsed, and executed with chilling precision. Before dawn, German troops crossed the Polish border. Tanks crushed fences. Soldiers advanced through fog, and the Luftwaffe bombed cities from above. But even before the first shot, Hitler had crafted a lie. A fake attack on a German radio station near Gliwice was staged, carried out by German operatives dressed as Polish soldiers. The world was told that Poland had attacked first. It was a deception meant to justify genocide. Inside Germany, propaganda machines went into overdrive. Newspapers screamed, "German blood has been spilled," and citizens believed their Führer was only defending his people. In reality, Poland was being torn apart by overwhelming force, its cities reduced to rubble, its civilians slaughtered in the chaos. The Blitzkrieg lightning war was unleashed. Fast-moving tanks, mechanized infantry, and relentless air raids struck Poland with the speed the world had never seen. It was not just military innovation, it was terror turned into a strategy. Roads were lined with refugees, trains packed with frightened families, and skies filled with death. While the world watched in horror, Hitler's allies moved too. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, fulfilling the secret clause of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Poland, caught between two monsters, was torn in half. Its army fought bravely, but was outnumbered, outgunned, and betrayed by diplomacy. Within weeks, the country was gone, erased from the map once more. Britain and France declared war on Germany, but their response was slow, hesitant, and disorganized. The phony war had begun months of waiting while Poland burned. The truth is harsh. The West was unprepared, divided, and unwilling to believe the scale of evil unfolding before them. As Polish cities fell, executions began. Intellectuals, priests, and resistance leaders were rounded up and shot. Villages were wiped out. The first concentration camps began filling with prisoners. The machinery of death was in motion, though the world did not yet understand what it meant. In less than a month, Poland was conquered. The world had entered the age of total war, and Hitler's unstoppable march had begun. By the winter of 1939, Poland was gone, swallowed by the twin beasts of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, but the echoes of its fall carried far beyond its borders. Europe watched, frozen in disbelief. The world had declared war, yet the guns along the Western Front remained silent. This silence was not peace. It was fear. It was hesitation. It was the calm before a storm that would consume continents. Britain and France, though technically at war with Germany, hesitated to strike. Their armies waited behind the fortified walls of the Maginot Line, a fortress of steel and concrete built to stop an enemy that would never come that way. Politicians promised action, but what followed was months of inaction, a period history would call the phony war. Meanwhile, Hitler prepared his next move. He had seen how fear paralyzed his enemies, how the world's conscience bent under pressure. Factories in Germany worked day and night, churning out weapons and ammunition. The Reich's borders buzzed with trains carrying tanks, fuel, and men. Germany was no longer just a nation, it was a machine of war, perfected through terror and precision. And in that silence, something else was happening. A quiet diplomacy of betrayal. Neutral countries, fearing invasion, signed secret deals. Industrialists in Sweden sent iron ore to fuel Hitler's armies. The Netherlands, Belgium, and Norway clung to neutrality, believing distance could protect them. But Hitler's plans stretched far beyond Poland. The Reich's shadow was spreading westward. Inside Germany, the propaganda deepened. The people believed they were unstoppable, chosen by destiny to reclaim the world. But even within Hitler's ranks, not everyone shared his madness. Some generals feared his aggression, but they stayed silent, trapped between loyalty and survival. In Nazi Germany, a single question could be fatal. Then came April 1940, and silence finally shattered. Hitler's forces struck Denmark and Norway in lightning speed. Paratroopers descended from the skies. Warships filled the fjords. Within days, both nations fell. Europe began to understand there would be no safety in neutrality, no mercy in surrender. By May, the world's fear turned to panic. German armies rolled into Belgium, the Netherlands, and finally, France. The same blitzkrieg that crushed Poland now swept across Western Europe like wildfire. Cities fell faster than news could travel, and still, the world struggled to grasp the truth that Hitler's vision was not just conquest, but domination. His war was not only against nations, but against the idea of freedom itself. Europe's silence had ended, but at a cost too great to measure. May 10, 1940, the day France's fate was sealed. For months, the French believed the Maginot Line would protect them, an unbreakable wall of steel, concrete, and pride. But Hitler had learned from history. He would not attack where France was strong. He would strike where she was blind, through the dense, unforgiving forests of the Ardennes, where no general thought tanks could pass. The German blitzkrieg roared to life once more. In just a few days, the impossible happened. The French defenses crumbled. German panzers poured through Belgium and Luxembourg, surrounding the Allied forces before they even realized what was happening. Communication broke down, chaos spread, and panic filled the air. France, once a proud empire, was collapsing under the weight of its own disbelief. The world watched in shock as the British Expeditionary Force and French troops were pushed back to the beaches of Dunkirk. There, hundreds of thousands of soldiers stood trapped, cornered by the sea and advancing German divisions. Hitler's Luftwaffe filled the skies, raining bombs on the helpless men below. But from across the English Channel came a miracle. Operation Dynamo. Ordinary fishermen, sailors, and civilians sailed their boats into war, rescuing more than 300,000 men under relentless fire. It was an act of courage amid catastrophe, yet it couldn't save France. By June, German forces entered Paris. The City of Lights went dark. Nazi flags draped from its grandest buildings. The Eiffel Tower stood under occupation. France, the symbol of culture and revolution, had fallen in just 6 weeks, a humiliation that stunned the world. Marshal Philippe Pétain, the hero of World War I, surrendered. A puppet government was installed in Vichy, obedient to Berlin. The dream of French freedom was now divided, half under direct German rule, half pretending to be independent, but both enslaved by the Reich. Yet amid the ruins, a new spirit was born: resistance. Across occupied France, ordinary men and women began to fight back. They printed underground newspapers, smuggled weapons, and sabotaged German trains. Their courage, though small in number, would one day light the path to liberation. Meanwhile, Hitler stood in Paris, gazing upon his conquest with triumph. But his victory carried a hidden truth. He had awakened something far greater than fear. The British were not defeated. The world was not finished. The fire that burned across Europe would soon cross the skies toward England. The next chapter of this hidden war would be fought not on land, but in the heavens. Summer 1940. France had fallen. Europe was in chains. And only one nation stood between Hitler and total domination: Britain. But to conquer the island, the Führer would need to achieve something no one had done for centuries: defeat the British in their own skies. Thus began one of the greatest battles in human history, the Battle of Britain. Hitler's plan was simple: destroy the Royal Air Force, then invade across the Channel under Operation Sea Lion. Every morning, the sirens wailed across London, warning of another incoming wave. Thousands of German bombers, escorted by the deadly Messerschmitt fighters, roared across the clouds. Below them, the young pilots of the RAF, many barely out of school, scrambled their Spitfires and Hurricanes into the air. What followed was not just a battle for territory, but for survival itself. The skies over England became a burning stage where courage met terror. Dogfights erupted among the clouds, engines screaming, bullets tearing through the mist. Pilots had seconds to live or die, their vapor trails crossing like ghosts in the sky. At first, the Luftwaffe dominated. British airfields burned, radar stations were destroyed, and London faced the beginning of a nightmare: the Blitz. Bombs rained down on cities night after night. Homes, churches, and schools vanished in firestorms. Yet the British spirit refused to break. People slept in underground stations, singing songs to drown out the sound of falling bombs. Through the rubble and smoke, one message echoed: we will never surrender. Then came Hitler's fatal mistake. Frustrated by his inability to break the RAF, he shifted his focus from military targets to civilian cities, hoping to crush British morale. But it had the opposite effect. The RAF recovered, rebuilt, and retaliated. Under the leadership of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding and Winston Churchill's defiance, Britain held firm. The few, Churchill called them, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Those few pilots turned the tide. By October 1940, the Luftwaffe was bleeding, thousands of aircraft lost, pilots exhausted. For the first time, Hitler was defeated. His invasion plans were shelved. The skies over Britain remained free, but freedom came at a cost: thousands of civilians dead, cities in ruins. Still, Britain stood unbroken, a lone light in Europe's darkness. The hidden truth of this battle was not just military victory, it was psychological. The myth of Nazi invincibility had shattered, and though the war was far from over, hope had returned to the world. When the skies over Britain turned red with fire, the war came home. The Blitz, Hitler's campaign of terror, was not just an attack on soldiers or airfields, but on the soul of a nation. From September 1940 to May 1941, Germany launched a relentless bombing assault on British cities. Night after night, the sirens wailed, and the people of Britain faced a storm unlike any in history. London became the main target. The city of light, of history, a heart, turned into a sea of flames. The Thames reflected burning buildings. Entire neighborhoods vanished in a single raid. Children were sent to the countryside. Families huddled in underground tunnels. And yet, life refused to stop. Even as bombs fell, trains ran, hospitals worked, and the spirit of defiance grew stronger. This was not a war fought only with guns. It was fought with endurance. The German Luftwaffe believed that destroying Britain's morale would force surrender. But in those dark nights, courage was born in every home. Men and women volunteered as firefighters, rescuers, and medics. Ordinary citizens became silent heroes, digging survivors from rubble, sharing the little food they had, singing softly through fear. The Blitz was not limited to London. Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham, Bristol, and Manchester all felt the wrath of the Luftwaffe. On November 14, 1940, Coventry was nearly erased in a single night. Factories, homes, and cathedrals burned under a rain of bombs. The city's ruins became a symbol of destruction and resistance. Propaganda was used on both sides. Hitler called the bombings retaliation, claiming justice for German losses. But the hidden truth was far darker. The Blitz was designed to break the will of the people, to crush hope itself. What Hitler didn't understand was that every falling bomb only hardened British resolve. Each night of destruction became another reason to fight back. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth refused to leave London. They walked through the wreckage with their people, showing that no one, not even royalty, was untouched by war. Winston Churchill's words echoed through the radio: "You do your worst, and we will do our best." Those words became a shield stronger than steel. By the spring of 1941, the Luftwaffe was stretched thin. Hitler's focus shifted east, toward the Soviet Union. The bombing raids slowed not because Britain surrendered, but because Germany was preparing for an even greater betrayal. The Blitz had failed. Britain still stood, scarred but unbroken, its courage now carved into history. June 22, 1941, dawn broke over the vast plains of Eastern Europe. The air was still, the birds silent. And then came the thunder. Over 3 million German soldiers, thousands of tanks, and swarms of aircraft crossed into the Soviet Union. Hitler had broken the pact he once swore to uphold. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, had begun. The world was about to witness a new kind of horror. For 2 years, Hitler and Stalin had pretended to be allies, trading resources, exchanging technology, and dividing Poland. But Hitler's ambitions were never meant to stop at the border. In his mind, the East was a land to be conquered, a place for his Aryan Empire to expand. He called it Lebensraum, living space. Behind that word lay a plan of mass extermination. At sunrise, the skies over the Soviet Union filled with German bombers. Airfields were destroyed before Soviet planes could take off. Entire divisions were wiped out in hours. The Red Army, caught unprepared, was thrown into chaos. Cities fell one after another: Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev. In just weeks, millions of Soviet soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. It was Blitzkrieg on an unimaginable scale. But there was more to Barbarossa than strategy. It was an ideological war, a war of annihilation. Hitler saw the Slavic people as inferior, unworthy of life. Behind the front lines, Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, followed the army, executing Jews, communists, and civilians by the tens of thousands. Villages were burned, families murdered, entire communities erased. The invasion was not just conquest, it was genocide in motion. The Soviet leadership reeled from the betrayal. Stalin, in shock, disappeared from public view for days. But the Soviet people, from soldiers to peasants, began to rise. Factories were dismantled and moved east beyond German reach. Women, children, and the elderly worked day and night to build tanks, bullets, and hope. And slowly, through blood and fire, the tide began to turn. Hitler had underestimated the land, the people, and the winter. As the German army pushed deeper into Russia, their supply lines stretched thin. The roads turned to mud, the cold became their enemy, and the Soviet resistance grew fiercer. The hidden truth: Hitler's arrogance was his greatest weakness. He had opened a front so vast that even victory could not sustain him. By the time the snows began to fall, German troops were freezing, starving, and dying by the thousands. What was meant to be a quick conquest had become a nightmare, and as 1941 drew to a close, the war that Hitler started was slipping from his control. September 1941, the German army reached the gates of Leningrad, the city of art, culture, and revolution. Once the heart of Russia's spirit, it now stood at the center of Hitler's cruelest campaign. What began as a military operation would become one of the longest and most brutal sieges in human history, a 900-day nightmare known as the Siege of Leningrad. Hitler's goal was not to capture the city, it was to erase it. He ordered his troops to surround Leningrad completely, cutting off all supplies of food, fuel, and hope. No surrender, he declared. Let the city starve. And so, the city of 3 million was sealed off, trapped between the German army and the frozen Baltic Sea. As winter fell, Leningrad became a frozen prison. Temperatures dropped below -30. Rations dwindled to a few grams of bread per person. Bread made partly from sawdust. People tore wallpaper to eat the glue, boiled leather, and burned furniture for warmth. Thousands collapsed in the streets, their bodies buried under layers of snow. In silence, families huddled together, waiting for dawn, not knowing if they would see it again. Yet through unimaginable suffering, the people of Leningrad refused to surrender. Musicians still played symphonies in frozen theaters. Writers recorded the truth in secret diaries. Mothers, teachers, and soldiers all became symbols of unbroken spirit. The famous Road of Life was carved across the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga, where trucks carried tiny amounts of food and evacuated the dying. Each trip meant death could strike at any moment, from bombs, frost, or thin ice. But the drivers never stopped. Inside Hitler's war rooms, the siege was celebrated as a triumph. But his army was also suffering. The longer the city endured, the more his forces were drained. The harsh winter, the endless resistance, and the courage of the civilians turned what was meant to be a quick victory into a slow defeat of morale. Even German soldiers began to question the cost of their orders. By 1943, the Red Army began to push back. Soviet artillery pounded German positions day and night. In January 1944, after nearly 2.5 years, the siege was finally broken, but the price was beyond imagination. Over 1 million people dead, mostly civilians. Leningrad had survived, but it would forever carry the scars of hunger, loss, and heroism. The hidden truth of Leningrad is not only one of tragedy, it's one of resistance. When the world expected surrender, the city chose defiance. When all seemed lost, humanity refused to die. It was the summer of 1942. The German war machine, once unstoppable, now set its sights on a new prize. Stalingrad, a city that carried the name of the Soviet leader himself, Joseph Stalin. To Hitler, its capture would be both a strategic and symbolic victory, proof that Nazi Germany could crush the Soviet heart. The Battle of Stalingrad would become more than just a fight for a city. It would become the defining moment of World War II. In the early days, the Germans advanced swiftly. Bombs rained down, turning the once bustling city on the Volga River into a wasteland of rubble and dust. Factories, homes, and hospitals were reduced to ashes. But within those ruins, the Soviets dug in. Every building, every street, every basement became a fortress. It was no longer a war of tanks and airplanes. It was a war fought room to room. Brick by brick, Soviet soldiers vowed, not one step back, and they meant it. Even as the Germans pushed forward, the Red Army refused to surrender a single block. Entire platoons were wiped out for a few meters of ground. Snipers like Vasily Zaitsev turned the ruins into hunting grounds, spreading fear among the invaders. The Volga ran red with blood, but the Soviets held on. Winter arrived early that year, bitter and merciless. The German Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, found itself trapped inside the frozen shell of the city. Cut off from supplies, they faced hunger, frostbite, and constant Soviet assault. Hitler ordered Paulus to hold his ground, declaring, "Surrender is forbidden." But the men on the front lines were already starving, dying one by one in the ruins of their own ambitions. Then came Operation Uranus, the Soviet counterattack. In November 1942, the Red Army struck like a thunderclap, encircling the German forces completely. It was a masterstroke of strategy, a reversal that shocked the world. For the first time, the invincible Nazi army was trapped. The hunters had become the hunted. Inside the encircled city, chaos ruled. Bodies lay frozen in the snow. German soldiers burned maps and papers to keep warm. They prayed for airdrops that never came. By February 1943, the once proud Sixth Army was broken. Paulus finally surrendered, defying Hitler's orders but saving what few lives remained. Stalingrad was a graveyard, over 2 million casualties on both sides. But it was also a symbol, a message to the world that Hitler's empire could bleed. The tide of the war had turned. From this point on, Nazi Germany would never recover its strength. The victors had paid a terrible price, but the path to liberation had begun. While the world's attention was fixed on the roaring tanks and exploding skies, another battle was being fought in the shadows. A war without uniforms, fought by ghosts in the night. This was the secret war. The silent struggle of spies, saboteurs, and codebreakers who shaped the fate of nations without ever firing a gun. From Berlin to London, from Tokyo to Washington, an invisible web of espionage stretched across continents. Each message, each code, and each whisper carried the power to win or lose the war. In the heart of Britain, a place called Bletchley Park became the nerve center of Allied intelligence. Here, brilliant mathematicians, linguists, and cryptanalysts worked day and night to crack the German Enigma code, a cipher so complex that Hitler believed it was unbreakable. But among those quiet minds was a man who changed history, Alan Turing. With his revolutionary machine, the early form of a computer, Turing helped decipher Enigma's secrets, giving the Allies access to Germany's deepest military plans. It is said that his work shortened the war by more than 2 years, though few knew his name until long after the fighting ended. Across the Channel, the French resistance operated in silence, smuggling messages, sabotaging railways, and guiding Allied pilots to safety. Ordinary citizens became heroes. Farmers, teachers, and even children risked their lives to strike back against Nazi occupation. In the darkness of occupied Europe, courage became the greatest weapon. But espionage wasn't only the domain of the Allies. The German Abwehr and Soviet NKVD waged their own deadly games. Spies infiltrated embassies, forged documents, and turned double agents into living weapons. Every handshake could be a trap. Every letter could be a lie. Trust was the first casualty in the world of shadows. One of the greatest deception operations of the war was Operation Mincemeat. The British planted false invasion plans on a dead body, letting the Germans discover it, a ruse so perfect, it fooled Hitler himself. Because of it, thousands of Allied soldiers survived the invasion of Sicily. Meanwhile, in neutral countries like Switzerland and Sweden, entire networks of informants operated under diplomatic cover. Cafes, hotels, and train stations became the secret meeting grounds of spies exchanging information that could save or doom millions. This was the war no one saw. The war fought in whispers and shadows. No medals were given, no parades held, but in the silence of decoding rooms and secret meetings, the hidden soldiers of WWII shaped the outcome of humanity's greatest conflict. They were the unseen heroes of a war that demanded both strength and intellect, the ones who proved that sometimes the pen truly is mightier than the sword. In the blazing heat of the North African desert, the war took on a new form, a battle of dust, deception, and destiny. Here, under the burning sun, two legends faced each other: Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, and General Bernard Montgomery, the unyielding commander of the British Eighth Army. It was a campaign that would decide control over the Mediterranean and the gateway to the Middle East. The year was 1941. Rommel's Afrika Korps, fast and ruthless, swept through Libya and into Egypt with stunning speed. His tactics were brilliant, using mobility and surprise as weapons. Stronger than numbers, he became the master of the desert, striking like a phantom, appearing where the enemy least expected. His name spread like fire, feared by the Allies, admired even by his foes. But behind the glamour of Rommel's victories, the reality was harsh. The desert was unforgiving, scorching days, freezing nights, and endless sand that swallowed men and machines alike. Water was more precious than bullets. Both sides fought not only each other, but nature itself. Engines overheated, compasses failed, and soldiers collapsed beneath the merciless sun. By mid-1942, the German advance reached El Alamein, only a few hundred kilometers from the Suez Canal. If it fell, the Axis would control vital oil routes and possibly the entire Middle East. But standing in their way was Montgomery, a man of discipline and patience. He studied Rommel's tactics, learned his rhythm, and prepared his trap. Then came the Second Battle of El Alamein, a storm of fire and steel that lasted for 12 days and nights. The desert roared with the thunder of tanks and artillery. Flames lit the dunes as tracer rounds tore through the darkness. Rommel fought fiercely, but his supply lines were broken. His fuel gone, his soldiers exhausted. For the first time, the Desert Fox had met his match. On November 4, 1942, Montgomery's forces broke through. The Afrika Korps began its long retreat. The dream of Axis domination in Africa shattered. Winston Churchill declared, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." But the Desert War was more than a clash of generals. It was a testament to endurance. Tens of thousands perished in the sand, their bodies lost to time, their stories buried beneath the dunes. Yet their struggle decided the course of the war. Because in the deserts of North Africa, the myth of Nazi invincibility finally began to fade. Beneath the calm blue surface of the oceans, another war was raging, silent, cold, and deadly. This was the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest and most relentless campaign of World War II. While armies clashed on land and planes filled the skies, the oceans became the graveyards of men and steel. From the very beginning, Germany's U-boats, silent predators of the deep, prowled the Atlantic like wolves. Their mission was simple: cut off Britain's lifeline. Every ship that carried food, weapons, or fuel to the British Isles became a target. Convoys of merchant vessels crossed the ocean under constant threat, escorted by destroyers and corvettes that hunted the unseen enemy below. The sailors called it the Black Pit, where help could never reach them in time. At night, the sea came alive with death. Torpedoes streaked through the dark water, explosions lighting up the waves. Ships burned on the horizon as survivors clung to rafts, waiting for rescue that might never come. The U-boat struck without warning, disappearing into the depths before anyone could fight back. For the Germans, it was a game of patience and precision. For the Allies, it was a struggle for survival. But the Allies fought back with innovation. New sonar technology, depth charges, and air patrols began to turn the tide. Aircraft equipped with radar hunted U-boats from above, while escort carriers provided air cover far out to sea. By 1943, the hunters had become the hunted. The German wolf packs that once terrorized the Atlantic now found themselves trapped beneath the waves, hunted by the very prey they once devoured. Still, the cost was unimaginable. More than 70,000 sailors lost their lives in the Atlantic, their final resting place, the cold and endless sea. Each ship that sank was a small tragedy, each convoy that survived a small victory. And yet, those men, known to most, kept Britain alive. Without their sacrifice, the D-Day landings, and ultimately the liberation of Europe, would never have been possible. Far from the Atlantic, another battle raged in the vast Pacific Ocean. American and Japanese fleets clashed in titanic duels midway. Coral Sea, late Gulf battles that decided empires. But whether in the Pacific or the Atlantic, the sea remained the great equalizer, swallowing the strong and the weak alike. In the end, victory at sea was not just about ships and submarines. It was about endurance, courage, and the will to fight in the loneliest place on earth. For those who sailed the oceans of war, there was no glory, only survival. Their fight was unseen, but their legacy runs deep, beneath the waves that still whisper their names. Far from Europe's burning battlefields, another storm was spreading across the Pacific, a war of islands, oceans, and unimaginable destruction. It began with a single morning, December 7, 1941, when the rising sun turned to fire over Pearl Harbor. Japanese planes roared through the Hawaiian sky, raining death upon the unsuspecting American fleet. In just 2 hours, battleships burned, sailors drowned, and the United States was thrust into the deadliest conflict in human history. The attack was not just a strike, it was a message. Japan sought to dominate Asia and the Pacific, building an empire that stretched from China to the Philippines, from Burma to the Solomon Islands. Under the banner of the rising sun, its armies marched with ruthless precision. Cities fell one after another. In Nanjing, Manila, Singapore, and Burma, entire populations suffered the weight of Japan's ambition. The early months of the war were a nightmare for the Allies. The Japanese Navy ruled the seas. Their pilots seemed unstoppable, but beyond the victories, a dangerous arrogance began to grow. For the first time in modern history, the world had seen a new kind of warfare, swift, brutal, and terrifyingly efficient. Then, in June 1942, the tide began to turn. At a small cluster of islands called Midway, the United States struck back. Through intelligence and courage, American pilots ambushed Japan's fleet, sinking 4 of its prize aircraft carriers. It was a blow from which Japan would never fully recover. The hunter had become the hunted. From that moment, the Pacific became a graveyard of steel and fire. The U.S. adopted a strategy called island hopping, capturing one island at a time, each battle more brutal than the last. Names like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa became synonymous with horror. Soldiers fought hand to hand through jungles and caves. Flamethrowers turned bunkers into infernos. Neither side gave mercy, and neither expected it. In the skies above, American bombers unleashed destruction on Japanese cities. By 1945, Tokyo itself was burning, entire districts reduced to ashes in one night. The empire that had once seemed invincible now faced the same terror it had unleashed upon others. But the Pacific War was not just a clash of armies. It was a war of will. Every inch of ocean, every island, every life lost was part of a larger storm that would soon engulf Japan entirely. The rising sun that had once burned so bright was beginning to set in fire, in blood, and in silence. By 1943, the darkness that had spread across the world began to flicker with light. After years of retreat and loss, the Allies were finally awakening. From the sands of North Africa to the snows of Russia, from the skies of Britain to the islands of the Pacific, the tide was turning. The world, once paralyzed by fear, was beginning to fight back. The first signs of this awakening came with El Alamein and Stalingrad, 2 names that shattered the myth of Axis invincibility. For the first time, the Allies were on the offensive. In North Africa, Rommel's once feared Afrika Korps was driven westward, crushed by combined British and American forces. In the east, the Red Army surged forward, reclaiming the cities and villages that had been soaked in their blood. Then came the invasion of Italy. Allied troops stormed the beaches of Sicily in July 1943. Hitler's ally, Benito Mussolini, was overthrown, and the once proud fascist empire began to crumble from within. German troops rushed south to hold Italy, but they were fighting a losing battle against both the Allies and time itself. The dream of Nazi domination was beginning to unravel. In the skies, Allied bombers struck deep into the heart of Germany. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin were reduced to rubble. The factories that once fueled Hitler's war machine were now twisted ruins of metal and fire. But victory came at a terrible cost. Thousands of airmen never returned, their mission swallowed by clouds of flak and flame. Across the Atlantic, the United States was transforming into the arsenal of democracy. Factories that once built cars now forged tanks, planes, and ammunition by the millions. Women took up the tools of war, working in shipyards and assembly lines. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of strength, proof that every hand, every worker, was part of the fight for freedom. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, American forces clawed their way across the islands, inch by inch, against a determined enemy that refused to surrender. Each victory was paid for with unimaginable blood. but each brought the Allies one step closer to Japan's shores. Unity became the Allies' greatest weapon. Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, China, and dozens of nations stood shoulder to shoulder against tyranny. Their differences were vast, their goals not always the same, but they shared one unbreakable truth. The world would not bow to the darkness of fascism. By the end of 1943, the war was far from over, but for the first time, victory no longer seemed impossible. The sleeping giant had awakened, and its roar would soon shake the foundations of the Axis world. While armies clashed and empires fell, another war was being fought, one not on the battlefield, but in the shadows of barbed wire and smoke. It was the war against humanity itself, a horror so vast, so deliberate, that history would forever remember it as the Holocaust, the darkest chapter of World War II. It began quietly, with laws and propaganda. Jews, Roma, the disabled, and others deemed unworthy by Nazi ideology were stripped of their rights, their jobs, their names. Children were banned from schools, businesses were marked, and homes were seized. Neighbors turned away in silence. The world did not yet understand what was coming, but the machinery of death had already begun. When the war expanded, so did Hitler's plan, the so-called final solution. Deportation trains rumbled day and night, carrying millions to places whose names would become eternal symbols of evil. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, or Majdanek, Bergen-Belsen. Behind the fences of these camps, humanity ceased to exist. Families were torn apart the moment they arrived. The young and strong were sent to work. The elderly, the sick, and children were sent directly to the gas chambers. The air was thick with the smell of death. The silence broken only by the sound of boots and orders. Inmates were reduced to numbers tattooed on their skin, their identities erased, their lives measured in days or hours. And yet, even in that abyss, some refused to let the light die. In secret, prisoners kept diaries, hid photographs, and whispered prayers. They clung to hope, not for survival, but so the truth would one day be known. Among them were doctors, musicians, and poets who continued to create tiny acts of rebellion against a system built to destroy them. The Nazis documented everything: lists, reports, photos, as if evil needed proof of its own existence. When the Allies finally liberated the camps in 1945, what they found defied imagination. Mountains of shoes, piles of glasses, suitcases with named silent witnesses to over 6 million lives extinguished. Even hardened soldiers wept at the sight. The Holocaust was not only a German crime, it was a human tragedy, a warning of what happens when hate goes unchallenged. When silence becomes complicity, it was proof that civilization is fragile, that darkness can grow quietly until it consumes all light. And yet, from the ashes, survivors rose broken but alive to tell the world what they had seen. Their voices became the conscience of history, reminding us that remembering is not enough. We must never allow such darkness to return. The darkest years of World War II, when entire nations seemed to have fallen under the weight of tyranny, a spark of defiance still burned. It was faint, fragile, but it refused to die. That spark was the resistance. Men and women who chose to fight back from the shadows. Across occupied Europe, ordinary people became soldiers of silence. They carried no banners, wore no uniforms, and swore no oaths, yet their courage rivaled that of any army. Their battlegrounds were backstreets, forests, and secret rooms. Their weapons were whispers, sabotage, and belief in freedom. In France, the resistance moved like ghosts through the night. They printed underground newspapers, smuggled messages to London, and helped Allied pilots escape capture. Railways were sabotaged, bridges blown, and enemy supply lines cut. Every act of defiance was a death sentence if discovered, yet they did it anyway. Names like Jean Moulin and Lucy Aubruck became symbols of courage against impossible odds. In Poland, one of the strongest resistance networks in all of Europe was born. Fighters carried out daring operations from smuggling Jewish children out of ghettos to launching uprisings against Nazi rule. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943 stands as one of the most Heroic moments in human history, a desperate fight by the trapped and starving against overwhelming force. They knew they could not win, but they fought so the world would know. They did not go quietly. In Norway, saboteurs braved the frozen wilderness to destroy a Nazi heavy water plant, crippling Germany's nuclear ambitions. In Yugoslavia, Tito's partisans waged a relentless guerrilla war that tied down entire divisions of German troops. In Greece, Italy, and the Netherlands, freedom fighters rose up, guided by nothing more than hope. The resistance was not just about weapons and explosions. It was about humanity. People hid Jews in their homes, forged false papers, and risked everything to protect strangers. Priests, farmers, students, even children became silent warriors. Their strength was not in numbers, but in the belief that evil must never be accepted, not even in silence. When the Allies finally landed in Europe, it was these invisible soldiers who paved the way. They cut communications, destroyed railways, and guided troops through enemy territory. Their work saved thousands of lives and hastened liberation. Many never lived to see the end of the war. They were caught, tortured, executed, their names erased. But their legacy endures in every story of courage told since. The resistance was proof that even in humanity's darkest night, there were still stars that refused to fade. They were not soldiers of nations, they were soldiers of conscience. June 6, 1944, a date forever etched into the history of the modern world, D-Day. The day when the tide of war finally turned against Hitler's fortress of tyranny. For years, Europe had been enslaved. Now, the world was ready to fight back. Before dawn broke over the cold waters of the English Channel, more than 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 156,000 Allied soldiers prepared for the greatest invasion in human history. The plan was audacious: to storm the beaches of Normandy and open the long-awaited Second Front against Nazi Germany. It was a gamble with millions of lives at stake. The Germans knew an invasion was coming, but they didn't know where. Through deception, the Allies convinced Hitler that the attack would come at Pas de Calais, not Normandy. This brilliant ruse, known as Operation Bodyguard, left German defenses stretched and confused. Still, the Atlantic Wall was formidable, a line of steel, mines, and concrete designed to crush any invasion. As night faded, paratroopers of the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, along with the British 6th Airborne, dropped deep behind enemy lines. Their mission: to cut off reinforcements, destroy bridges, and sow chaos before the main assault began. Many never even reached the ground alive. Those who did fought isolated battles in the dark, confused, scattered, yet determined. Then, as dawn broke, the horizon erupted. The sea roared with thunder as Allied ships unleashed hell upon the coast. The beaches were codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Each name would soon be written in blood. At Omaha Beach, American troops faced a storm of bullets. Machine gun fire ripped through the waves. Bodies fell before they reached the shore. The water turned red, sand turned to chaos, and yet they advanced. Step by step, inch by inch, they climbed the cliffs under relentless fire. The cost was unbearable, but retreat was never an option. By noon, the beaches were secure. By nightfall, over 150,000 men stood on French soil. The invasion had succeeded, but at a terrible price. Thousands lay dead, and yet their sacrifice gave life to freedom itself. Hitler was furious. He refused to believe Normandy was the true invasion site, a fatal mistake that doomed his armies in France. Within weeks, Allied forces would break through, racing across Europe toward Germany. D-Day was not just a military victory, it was the triumph of courage, unity, and human will. Men from America, Britain, Canada, and dozens of nations had come together, not for conquest, but for liberation. The world had been on its knees, but on that day, it began to stand again. After the storm of D-Day, France began to breathe again, but the path to freedom was paved with fire and blood. From the beaches of Normandy, the Allied forces surged forward, driving the Germans back through the shattered countryside. Every town, every village, every city became a battleground in a struggle for liberty. Paris, the heart of France, had been under Nazi control for 4 long years. Its streets, cafes, and boulevards whispered the memory of occupation, fear, and silence. But by August 1944, the resistance rose like a tide, igniting the spark of revolt. French patriots, armed with little more than courage and stolen weapons, engaged in fierce street fighting against the German occupiers. Snipers fired from rooftops, barricades blocked streets, and the city trembled under gunfire and explosions. Meanwhile, Allied forces advanced relentlessly. American, British, Canadian, and Free French troops moved through Normandy, liberating towns one by one. The countryside was a patchwork of ruined villages and liberated pockets of hope. Every mile gained came with the cost of lives, soldiers and civilians alike. Finally, on August 25, 1944, Allied forces entered Paris. The German commander, realizing defeat was inevitable, surrendered the city. The streets erupted with celebration. French citizens, long oppressed and terrified, poured into the boulevards, waving tricolors. Strangers embraced. Bells rang from every cathedral. The cafes, once filled with fear, now overflowed with laughter and tears. The liberation was not just a military victory, it was the restoration of a nation's spirit. But the price was steep. Thousands had died in the fighting. Many more had suffered under occupation, and much of France lay in ruins. Yet the people had reclaimed their homeland, and with it, their hope. Beyond Paris, the Allies pressed eastward. The German army, battered and demoralized, retreated toward the Rhine. French railways, factories, and towns, once paralyzed by war, began to awaken under the guidance of returning officials and soldiers. The liberation of France signaled the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The hidden truth of France's liberation lies not only in the soldiers who fought on the front lines, but in the courage of civilians who resisted, hid fugitives, sabotaged enemy operations, and refused to accept tyranny. It was a nation reborn from ashes, guided by the unbreakable will of its people. The victory in France inspired the Allies to push further toward Belgium, the Netherlands, and ultimately Germany itself. It was proof that even after years of darkness, humanity's courage could reclaim the light.